Welcome to session 3, Non-Human Animals in Art and Literature. And our first speaker is Esme Garlake. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Esme is an art historian and a climate activist, and from September 2023 will begin PhD at UCL. A research will investigate material and artistic representation of non-human life in the early 16th century Italy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and I've really enjoyed all of the talks so far. I feel like it's a really lovely space to come to where we're all from different angles, and I've already learned a lot. So today is going to be hopefully a bit of an introductory talk. You don't have to know much about art history before. And maybe you already do, but yeah, this is going to be about Giovanni da Udine's art and in general non-human animals in art history. So art history is all about interrogating how we create, use and see images over time. It has the potential to help us think more critically about human relationships with non-human animals in the natural world, but only when we allow ourselves to do that. Animal studies, eco-criticism, and other methodologies which foreground non-hierarchical approaches will help us to do this. So I want to begin by thinking a bit about how we see, I want to begin by thinking about how we see non-human animals in Western art in general. Generally, we're not very good at noticing whether the animals are dead or alive, captive or free. Gallery labels hardly ever encourage us to consider the agency or once aliveness of animals or of its suffering. Compare this to how accustomed we are to seeing images of one particular dead human body of Christ in Western art, and how there's a consistent emphasis on trying to evoke empathy in viewers in that case. When it comes to depictions of dead animals, instead, we tend to focus on the artistic skill or symbolic meanings or simply the beauty of these depictions. For example, 17th century Dutch still life paintings often include dead animals from the New World often, but these are rarely acknowledged as having once had active presences in the world. Instead, they're interpreted as another signifier of material and colonial wealth in Dutch Golden Age art and that era. And those two aren't mutually exclusive, but one often takes a higher precedent than the other. So I want to explore these ideas in a bit more depth through the case study of this fine-looking man called Giovanni da Udine and his artistic depictions of non-human animals. So he was working in Rome in the early 16th century, and I want to explore by how looking at historical images in a way that foregrounds human, non-human power dynamics will have the effect of disrupting our habits of looking, which in turn helps us to more broadly change our perceptions of human, non-human relationships. So a bit about Giovanni da Udine, just to give some context. This is what art historians always need to do, especially when we're going further back. So Giovanni da Udine was known as an animal painter. He was famous in his day for his naturalistic depictions of flora and fauna. He was born in the region of Veneto, Italy, in 1487. And as a young artist in Venice, he probably met the German master Albert Dürer in 1506. These are two watercolors by Dürer. And so Giovanni would have been able to see these watercolors up close. Since the mid-15th century, so around 1450s, artists in Venice had been heavily influenced by Northern European animals and plants from observation. In the mid-1510s, which is the kind of period we're going to be talking about more, Giovanni moved to Rome and he started working in Raphael's workshop. As an already established artist, he immediately became the workshop specialist in naturalistic imagery of animals, plants, and objects. In Rome, Giovanni was also celebrated for finding the recipe for ancient Roman stucco, which is a technique which uses plasterwork to create these three-dimensional ornamentations that were then painted on. And it's important to note here that all of Giovanni's naturalism was tightly connected to artistic interests at the time in the classics. So they were harking back to these ancient Roman and Greek texts and artworks, which were highly naturalistic as well. So today I'm going to mainly focus on Giovanni da Udine's drawings of non-human animals, which were made roughly around the time that he was in Raphael's workshop, but it's hard to date these precisely. So what reactions do we have when we first see these drawings? I know that for me, when I first saw them a few years ago, when I was doing my master's, especially as an animal and a nature lover, I was amazed by their accuracy and their precision, and also by their beauty. And I'm not alone in that. Giovanni has, since he was alive, and over the centuries, has long been praised for his accuracy. For art historians, we tend to focus on this being significant because it tells us that artists from this time were increasingly drawing from life. So Dürer, who Giovanni met in Venice, possibly, and Raphael are among the earliest examples of artists who are sketching from life. In Raphael's case, that's more just human models. But with Dürer, Raphael, and Giovanni's drawings, these are celebrated by art historians, signifying the beginnings of the Enlightenment. Empiricism, scientific observation, looking to reality, nature. And so from our modern perspective, we think that's progress. And we see, but we'll see as we go through that obviously that idea of progress is much more complicated than we think, and tightly bound to colonial structures of categorizing and muting the natural world of non-human beings, and also non-Western ways of thinking about the natural world. So I'd like to start with these this is the same sheet, this is the front and this is the back, these studies by Giovanni. There are clues here that Giovanni has been making these studies from life, particularly this central parrot here. So it's in a lively upright position on a perch, and also you can see around its toes these red and chest, these red sketches, which suggests that he's made an undersketch very quickly and built up layers. Other sketches show this one is here. You can see that this is an ink sketch that's been made very quickly. You can see the zigzags at the bottom of it, which suggests almost that Giovanni has started to make this sketch, but then changed, because this is a moving animal. And if you've ever tried drawing animals, that tends to happen. Although my cat tends to be in one position, asleep, which is a lot easier to draw. But other studies on the same sheet complicate our idea of drawing from life. On the other side of the sheet, we see this bird in red and black chalk, and it's been sketched with this, it has this level of accuracy and detail, which suggests it has been drawn from observation, but its position with its beak open and its wings outstretched suggests that this is a dead bird, it's motionless. If you disagree, do tell me, but I think it looks pretty dead. And so there are other drawings by Giovanni which show birds in similar positions. This is a watercolor of a green woodpecker, which shows a level of detail and accuracy to the coloring and markings and feathers, which Giovanni would most likely not have been able to achieve had this been an alive animal. So clearly the use of dead animals has allowed Giovanni to have this uninterrupted close observation. Dead animals also become malleable objects for the artist. So in this watercolor sketch of blue tits, you can see that he's changed them into different positions. They may be two different birds, it may be one bird that he's changed, although apparently rigor mortis sets them very quickly for small animals, someone told me that. And so I'd like to think about how this process of objectification has a parallel in art historical approaches to depictions of women in Western art history. Feminist approaches emphasize the exploitative dynamics between artists and female life models. Jill Saunders, in her book, The Nude, A New Perspective, which was published in 1989, writes, in Western art, the woman is the passive object, man the analytical creator. I would like to suggest that just as art historical depictions of women are increasingly viewed in relation to the patriarchy and patriarchal structures, when viewing historical depictions of non-human animals, we need to consider them in relation to historical exploitation of non-human beings in the natural world. This also relates closely to post-colonial perspectives in art history and beyond. Amitav Ghosh, in his wonderful book, The Nutmeg's Curse, which was published in 2001, says, colonialism was the process of subjugating and reducing to muteness an entire universe of beings that was once thought of as having agency, powers of communication, and the ability to make meaning: animals, trees, volcanoes, nutmegs. So, for example, when Giovanni is drawing parrots from life, how did he have access to these? Almost certainly it was through the papal menagerie, which would have been in the Vatican, which housed a huge variety of animals that had been traded, given as diplomatic gifts, or stolen from across the world. His frescoes here in the Vatican Loggia show a particular species of Caribbean parrots, which was still very new to Europe at the time, brought back from the New World by colonists. When we think about these animals' lives and where they came from, we're more able to understand that these artworks are part of massive displays of wealth and materialism, enabled by growing European colonialism in the start of the 16th century. In their book, Merchants and Marvels, Paula Findlay and Pamela Smith explained that neither curiosities nor paintings existed only in the realm of representation. They also played an active role in the world of commerce. And even in cases where non-human animals are domesticated, ordinary, part of cohabitation spaces, such as this lovely ram, Giovanni still depends on physical access to this animal. It's a record of human interaction with domesticated animals. And so when any artist draws non-human animals from life, it always reveals to some extent some element of human control over non-human life. But these images don't just tell us about human control over non-humans in real life situations as a kind of social history. They also emphasize the particular power that an artist has. So when we look at Giovanni's frescoes, he's responsible for the vegetation around here, all of that detail, and the birds you see around, dotted around. And then Raphael's workshop, other people would have done these human figures. When we look at his frescoes, we realize that he's breathed life back into these images of dead animals. So this is the Villa Farnesina in Rome. And he's actually used the same, might recognize this kind of similar position of the blackbird with its wings outstretched. And when we look up close at it, it seems motionless and lifeless. But we have to remember that people are viewing this from the ground up. And actually, when we view it, so there's the sketch that he's referring to, I argue. But when we're actually looking from the ground up, it becomes part of a whole image of nature that's teeming with life, and that people would have celebrated at the time, and we still celebrate how alive it is, how like the natural world it is. And the same is here. You can see, so this part is up here in the loggia, and you can see that here's the green woodpecker in a different position, but it's got the accuracy of markings and colorings. You can still tell it's the same type, that type of bird. And so, where am I going on this? Oh, it's taking me all the way to the top. Okay. Yeah, so as I'm saying, it seems to be teeming with life, but we, in that case, almost start to, if we don't actually think about the non-human presences in this, we start to erase the fact that there's been dead animals along the way and human control at every process of constructing this image and appearance. So to conclude, I've been arguing really that the exercise of letting ourselves see these dynamics of control in art is incredibly powerful for helping us almost inevitably to shift our sense of what it means to be human and non-human. It demands that we recognize non-human animals as having presences, as having been alive, and as having had at least some form of agency. And it also demands that we recognize our positions as human beings and how we choose to treat the non-human beings that we interact with. And I'd like to just end on a brief anecdote. This is not Giovanni's article, do you know? I was in the National Gallery in the winter at an exhibition dedicated to the American artist Winslow Homer. And I was looking at this amazing watercolor painting made in 1904. And next to me, I heard a woman say, "What a beautiful fish." All I could think about was the hook in its mouth. And neither of us were right. Both of those responses are valid, and they're also not mutually exclusive. In fact, I have this image up on my wall as a postcard. But I want us to start to think about, especially art historians, but all of us can do it when we're in galleries or looking at images in any context, about how shifting our perspectives when we look at images of non-human life can help us to start to heal those relationships. Yeah, and I hope that we can take that out with us. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Olympia Maila. And she's a PhD student at the University of Valencia, and her aim is to examine the relationships between non-human animals and humans in science fiction. She's going to talk about you.
Okay, so hello everyone. As Bianca mentioned, my name is Olympia Maila, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Valencia in Spain. And since I'm currently in the very early process of refining my research objectives and testing the waters to find out what directions my work could take, I thought I would share and discuss my ideas and research plans with all of you today. So, as the title of my presentation indicates, my research is based on the representations of non-human animals in Dune franchise. And I should probably point out that I use the term franchise because apart from Frank Herbert's original 6 novels, my research also covers the subsequent novels, comic books, and adaptations that have followed all of these works, the most notable of which are probably the film adaptations, such as David Lynch's 80s version and the more recent adaptation by Denis Villeneuve. So why did I specifically chose to focus on the Dune universe and base my research on it? The main reason is that the essential questions that stand at its core, at the core of all of these novels, they align with some of the most important questions within the animal studies and eco-criticism fields, such as what it means to be human and the links between humankind and the life that surrounds it. Another reason is that Dune is one of the most representative central novel series within the science fiction genre, a genre that has the potential to function as a mirror of the possible consequences of our actions, and that has an enormous creative range that allows us to examine the matters that define our existence, which is something that I consider useful for an analysis with an analysis of our relationship with non-human animals and non-human otherness. Thank you. Moreover, this genre is also characterized by its openness and freedom of analysis, and it is especially practical, in my opinion, for dealing with concepts and ideas that perhaps might not be as easily approached within other genres. As Jennifer Clements puts it, this genre is characterized by a speculative nature and by freedom from the boundaries of what is currently possible, which makes it an ideal testing ground for ethical concerns regarding non-human animals. And what is more, many of the alien characters present in the works belonging to this genre frequently serve as a means to represent non-human animals. As Cheryl Vint also explains, they can be represented in terms that we typically associate with animals, raising questions about how we interact with living animals that can vary, and also about animals as companions or fellow sentient. Another reason that motivated me to choose Herbert's body of work is the fact that even though it's been more than half a century since publication, many of its themes are still currently relevant, and the non-human animals present in its narrative is that the tension as allegories of both the treatment that animals in our natural environment receive on our part, as well as of the possible consequences that their destruction and extinction would entail. I also took into consideration the fact that the influence of many of the political, social, and cultural movements that took place in the second half of the 20th century can be identified and are very present in these books, as well as some of humankind's main concerns during that time regarding topics such as technoscience, gender politics, or environmentalism. The chief non-human animal presence in Dune, in my main objective of study, is the sandworm, a giant creature, the existence of which is pivotal in the narrative timeline of the 6 original books, since the relationship established between this creature and humans reflects the dangers of considering human beings as subjects external to nature. The Dune lore and universe is actually quite complex and full of important details, so the first thing I should probably clarify is the story's timeline. The first novel takes place 20,000 years in the future and places humanity far away from planet Earth, living on different planets around the universe and organized in a feudalistic political system known as the Empire. This political system is in fact quite fragile and vulnerable, the main reason being that its survival depends on a psychoactive and addictive substance known as the spice melange. This substance is exclusively found on the desert planet Arrakis, also known as Dune, and has a great value due to its multiple uses and properties. For instance, it can extend life, it is used with food, it is used as a compound for basic materials, and it can even be used for weapons, and also as the psychic stimulant, as it confers prescient ability. Perhaps this last detail is the most important one, given that the navigators of the Space Guild, which is the organization that guarantees and directs the commerce between the planets of the Empire, need spies to enter a physical state that allows them to see the future and trace safest routes for the interstellar travel. And in fact, their extended use of this substance alters the bodies to the point where their appearance is rather more amphibian than human-like, and they have to spend their lives in tanks filled with spice gas. Another significant detail regarding spice is that, seeing as the possession of the psychotropic drug grants an immeasurable power within the Empire, its acquisition is extremely complicated, which takes us to the figure of sandworms. So the production of spice depends entirely on the existence of the aforementioned sandworms, giant creatures that inhabit and simultaneously alter and depend on the ecosystem of Dune. This is at first a secret that ends up becoming a great political advantage for those who are aware of it. And here we can see an interpretation of the aspect of the guild navigators based on the fish-like features they are described with, as well as one of the most recent comic book representations of sandworms. Within this frail political system, there is one political influential faction that I should talk about as well, which is the Bene Gesserit, sisterhood formed ensuing a revolution against computers and thinking machines, which in consequence is focused on developing human abilities and has managed to master impressive physical and mental ability. They use religion as a cover for their political agenda and exert their influence, having the ability to access the multiple memories of their female ancestors, a practice which, once again, is dependent on spice consumption. Their main goal, as they describe it, is to sift humanity and control its genetic lines according to their interests and convenience. And the aim of their control is also the birth of what is known as the Quisitadera, a perfect male human being, able to see the future and what is more, access the male memories which they cannot access. So if we keep in mind the spatial and temporary scene of all of this long story, we can expect humankind to go through significant changes, the notion of humanity to have transcended. But to the Bene Gesserit, essentially, the distinction between human beings and non-human animals lies in the capacity to resist one's instincts and being able to put the survival of the others before one's own. In essence, they claim that they want humans who can resist what they call their animal instincts to be the survivors of the universe. They have several ways to test one's humanity, one of which is the Von Jabbar test, they basically place a poison needle close to the person they're testing while they're subdued to an unbearable level of pain. And if the person doesn't resist and slightly moves, they die. So what is the relationship between the sandworms and the Bene Gesserit? Basically, the lives of these non-human animals and the plants of this political faction are intertwined several times in this story. Ultimately, over the millennia, the lives of these animals will always be at the mercy of the decisions that humans make, to the point where their ecosystem is repeatedly changed and destroyed. And at one point, they practically go extinct, had it not been for a few specimens that the Bene Gesserit managed to save. The same thing can be said. The same thing can be said about the planet at the center of the story, Arrakis, which nevertheless ends up being totally destroyed. The sandworms' relationship with humans is also quite ambivalent and complex, in the sense that they are seen both as deities and at the same time treated as capital. As I have already pointed out, science fiction offers many possibilities to represent alterity, as well as the discrimination suffered by real-life minorities and women. And considering the importance that spice has in this fictional universe and the essential role that sandworms have in its existence, their exploitation with this end, as well as their symbiotic relationship with the ecosystem of Arrakis and the human beings they share their planet with, they serve as a reflective example of many of the relationships that are established between humans and non-human animals in our world. There are other interpretations and examinations of real-life concerns in this story, where even though we see women in positions of power, we also see futurist societies where women are exploited and have no agency, such as the case of the Venezuelans, an all-male political faction that becomes more and more important as the story progresses. They are specialized in genetic engineering and find a way to reproduce human beings through parthenogenesis. And the interesting thing about them is that all the men that are part of it are genetically altered, and in order to carry their experiments, they need to use a peculiar type of tanks, which are in fact the women left in their society who have been reduced to their reproductive systems and have no control over their own body. This situation, you might argue, is reminiscent and comparable to the exploitation that breeding animals are subdued to in the real world. So, having said all of this, my basic objectives so far are to explore the ethical consequences in Dune and the parallels between animal rights in fictional universes and the real world, and to examine how our anthropocentric relationship with non-human animals is portrayed within science fiction, as well as how human identity is built against animal identity. So if you have any feedback or questions, please let me know at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. I believe it was super interesting. Our last speaker is Sofia Duarte. Lost my first Sofia Duarte is a PhD student, PhD candidate in the doctoral program of language, literature and culture and its application at the University of Valencia as well. Her research revolves around Margaret Atwood's works and the presence of non-human animals in them. The floor is yours.
Okay, so before I begin, please let me know if my voice goes very low, because I tend to do that. So just go like that for how long that I have to speak louder. And also saying nothing, before I begin, I want to say thank you to CfHAS and for all of you for having us here today and giving us the opportunity to present our works. It's such a great time today. So as Bianca said, I'm going to be showing you what I've worked throughout these 3 years in my thesis, which focuses on non-human animals and fiction. So here's the index, but I'm just going to jump right straight into it. So I'm pretty sure that you know more what human animal studies are, but I wanted to go over it a bit regarding literature. So the presence of non-human animals within literature is undeniable. I think it will be impossible to conceive any kind of works without any kind of non-human representation. Sometimes we have non-human animals presented as characters within the story. Sometimes they're used to talk about human traditions, but sometimes they're also given protagonism and shown as sentient beings that have a story to tell. So authors from different and styles are now being studied under the gaze of the animal term. So my intention is to apply this to the fictional works written by Margaret Atwood, as I believe that her Canadian identity and her advocacy to preserve nature have greatly influenced her works, and I will show you later that it seems to be so. And she seems to have a deeper understanding of other non-human beings, and she presents them in her work. So what I will be doing in my thesis will be applying theories such as Deleuze and Guattari's becoming animal, Carol Adams' absent reference, or Josephine Donovan's aesthetics of care to her works. And since I think it's nice to have a different kind of views applying to her works and see in different ways that she perceives. So I think you might be familiar with her, but I will go very quickly over Margaret Atwood is. She has become a worldwide phenomenon, especially because of The Handmaid's Tale and the success a TV series has had throughout these years. But she has been publishing a great amount of work. When I mean a great amount of work, she has published. And it's been like that since the 60s, and she still continues to publish works. The latest one coming out a few months ago. So the thing is that she has written short fiction, she has written poems, children's books, but as I will show now, I've decided to round out my work only on her novels and graphic. Now, if you've seen The Handmaid's Tale or somewhat familiar with it, you know that gender and feminism is a key issue in Margaret Atwood's novel. And she goes over these topics through the female protagonist that she has, which is practically 99% of her works from the female perspective. They also share a Canadian identity, and what most of them share also is, even if it's not the main theme, religion and myth continually appears throughout her novel. However, what I'm mostly interested in, how she presents climate change over speculative fiction, and precisely nature and wilderness. So most of her works, nature and wilderness, play a fundamental role. It's just not by helping create the setting which a story takes place, which is what usually happens with most authors, but she also gives them an opportunity to tell their stories and making them even characters of her tales, as we will see later on. So the knowledge that she has about nature and the interest that she shows towards non-human animals is possibly one of the main reasons why I decided to study her works. And she often relies on them to tell her stories. And as I quote, she shares a connection with animals, and most of them occupy the post-human history of her life, discussing human behavior, but also celebrating the natural world and condemning materialism. So the research questions are here. What I want to do is I want to analyze the impact of non-human animals in the fictional worlds, novels, and comics. And if they're portrayed as sources that can be exploited by humans, if they lack any kind of legitimation and are inferior to us, or does she actually portray them as individuals with complex characters and who can suffer and are sentient? So these are the 4 questions that I'm going to be asking novels. So we have how they're represented, if they're represented as sentient beings, and if she does in fact incorporate the animal rights movement in the 70s. Can we see a progression in how she reflects them in her novel? And how does she frame the animal question with her perspective of gender and feminism? So, as I've mentioned before, Margaret Atwood has published quite a lot, and even though I tried to narrow it down, I'm down to 17 novels, and I did one. Yes. In the first year, it was like a challenge. And the 3, well, technically it's 2 graphic novels that she has. The reason why I decided to just focus on these is because I think that they will give me a better understanding, and realistically speaking, they're longer, so I'll be able to understand better how the human animals are portrayed. In a short story, it's a bit difficult, or in a poem, it tends to be used mostly as symbolism and not actually portrayed, but they definitely have some there that I want to work on later. So we have these words, and having read all of them, I've come up with several categories under which Margaret Atwood portrays animals. So, for example, I have considered that they play a fundamental role in constructing the Canadian identity through its wildlife, as we will see in the next line. Additionally, we see how they're part of the mystical world and ultimately become sacrificial figures. Having published speculative fiction novels, it is also interesting to analyze how they're represented in them, oftentimes merging into other chapters, such as the absence of non-human animals, but also the kinship between different species. Moreover, there's the predominant portrayal of non-human animals is that of the absent reference, as we mentioned before, and as consumable beings, which is linked to how women are portrayed in her novels. And the last chapter that I will be working on is becoming animal, and I will talk about that. Now, because of time, I won't go over everything, but I wanted to show you some examples of what can be found in her novel, and that maybe next time that you read a novel or a poem, that they'll help you look at it through a different light. So the first one will be the Canadian identity and wildlife. So we have seen that Atwood's characters, which are mostly Canadian origin, their identity is constructed through their wildlife that surrounds them. So she uses the symbolism that the wildlife of Canada holds to protect her attitude and her characters and their attitudes towards Canada, but also towards the rest of the world. An example that we have here is the beaver and their status as the national symbol of Canada, which characters in different novels argue whether it's truly the animal that they want to be associated with. We have to keep in mind that an animal that was once almost driven to extinction because they were hunted down. And as we see in the other example, she shows the expectations that Canadians perceive of themselves that have been suffered from other countries. And we all know from the United States, they have always had this tension. So as Linda Hutchins states, Canada technically became a nation in 1867, but, and I quote, "It continued to be a colony of Britain until, some would say, it graduated to being a colony of the United States." So we, even though the novels from the 70s, we still see this today. And we see some unfriendly American characters. But there's also a nicer way of seeing this Canadian identity, which is through how they perceive their surroundings, especially through the Canadian traditional wildlife, and how this affects their understanding of time, of space, of the changing of the seasons. Here, I would have needed more examples, but it's really beautiful to see how the characters notice that time is passing because they hear certain birds, they notice that certain flowers are coming up. It's quite beautiful. So the next one that I want to talk about are the absent reference that we see in the novel. So Carol Adams' sexual portraits of meat and the absent reference theory can be applied to practically all her novels. As Adam argues, it is through our actions, such as eating meat and the language that we use, so metaphors, that we contribute even further to the animal's absence. And I quote, "We distance ourselves from whatever it is by creating something that we have already objected." So this is the case for non-human animals as well as I've said, practically all her novels can be seen to this side. But the two that I find most interesting are The Edible Woman and The Penelope. This last one, it becomes evident how women and animals are treated as mere objects to be used by men at their will. So it retells the story of the Odyssey, but from the perspective of Penelope. And page after page, readers find examples of how women and animals perceive as inferiors. And as she says, they were treated like, quote, meat, which had no voice, and men helped themselves to the food and the women that were available to them. So they're basically the same. They're consumable beings, basically. Since we have the perspective of an algae, we discover a new side of the story. And as Adam argues, we learn what it feels like to be, and I quote, a piece of meat that is treated like an inert object when one is or was in fact a living feeling being. So this repression can also be perceived in the edible woman, where the protagonist slowly begins to reject food, particularly the one from animal origin. And this is, I argue that this is intrinsically connected to her loss of independence as a woman, as she becomes part of a patriarchal system. She has to get married. The husband, or soon-to-be husband, slowly decides everything for her, and this becomes reflected through her rejection of food. So this rejection of food also allows her to live a different lifestyle. She becomes aware of what is happening around her. She notices that the food, that the piece of meat that she has in front of her, it was actually a living being at one point. So Adam argues that this intrinsically patriarchal and male-oriented symbolism that meat eating food becomes shown in the novel. And it is what basically subjects do to objects, what someone does to something. And although at the end of the novel, this is a bit disappointed, she goes back to eating some food, some meat, most likely. She seems to have noticed that the world is actually a patriarchal system and that she can change that and live a different lifestyle if she wants to, but it has caused her this change in life. So then we have the kinship between species, also and aesthetics of care. So this theory is by Josephine Donovan. And what she proposes is going beyond the ethics of care and proceeding with what she calls the aesthetics of care, which is a position through which we attempt to see something without interpretation, making non-human animals the subject of their own stories by decentering the human perspective. As Donovan argues, and I quote, "It is the act of perceiving other creatures, subjects worthy of respect, whose different voices must be attended to, and with one whom is emotionally engaged, interwoven in an ecological and spiritual continuum." Now, this can be seen in two of her novels, in the Madame trilogy, which I'm familiar with, and her graphic novel, Angel Catbird. Now, the first trilogy, the Madame one, is what Bosmeyer argues is a literary contribution to the question of what it is. And basically in it, we see how the creators, which are post-humans, I guess we could say, that are beings that were created in a laboratory, slowly begin to take over the narrative, and they're the ones that are actually telling the story in this chapter. We also have the genetically modified piglets, and these two beings basically are the ones that are taking control of the situation of humanity, because it's basically in the brink of extinction. And I think it's interesting to look at how these two species are able to communicate, but humans cannot understand what the piglets are saying. And I don't know if she does it on purpose, but for me, it seems that here is mocking those who throughout history have defended that our ability for language is supposed to be what makes us superior to other beings. And here it tells humans the ones that are incapable of understanding. So we also have the graphic novel. And in it, we have the protagonist, which is basically a hybrid between a human, a cat, and a bird. And what's interesting about this is that once he suffers this transformation, he also has, on the one hand, the benefits, so you see the wings, the claws, but he also has the drawbacks of being these animals. So just to name one example, he goes to drink coffee and he spits it out because it's toxic for the plant. And what I think is quite interesting to do is every now and then in the graphic novel, we have what we see here. There are little tips, and Adwood tells you, okay, this is what you should do. For example, so avoid giving animals human food, or how can we help to avoid cats, for example, attacking birds and how they become threats to them. So she gives us hints on how we can actually help non-human animals and not simply exploit them or have them there as a pet, and be more aware of our surroundings. And with this, I'm finishing. The last one we have is the becoming animal. So this is quite a complex term by Deleuze and Guattari. Basically, very summarize what it says is that humans are the animals that indicate nature, and it is only by overcoming the self-denial and transcending that the human can accept the reality of its connection with non-human. It is through assemblages and rhizomes that a multiplicity of ideas exist, and they form what they call CfHAS, that is a multiplicity connected with each other, forming a relation with other beings and becoming something. It's very difficult, at least for me. I'm still trying, 4 years later, I'm still trying to understand their idea, but basically what I try to do is I analyze how the progress of simply being human with all its limitations is transformed in some of her novels, especially Surfacing, as they accept their connection with non-human animals and nature. So in this novel, the protagonist, who remains unnamed throughout the whole novel, slowly starts to realize how she has always viewed herself as a victim, despite actually being the one who portrays the victim, and ignoring those who really are victims. And it is through the process of becoming animal and shedding the human in her, you can say, that she can overcome this and truly understands the world that is around her. So towards the end of the novel, she begins to perceive herself as something else than human, something beyond, and that is within the true nature. We also see how she becomes afraid of humans, as she worries that they might do the same to her as they do to animals, that is treating them, hanging them, basically killing them. And in the last quote of the novel, she says that she's become simply a natural woman, and that humans, the rest of them, might be afraid of her and might not understand her connection with the natural. So, in a conclusion, basically, this is a very, very brief overview. I could go on for a long more, but I'm going to stop here. So, as I have shown, I think that Atwood seems to present non-human animals through a variety of viewpoints, some of them which are quite innovative for her, thinking that these novels, some of them are from the 70s. But she also falls into contradictions of how she portrays non-human animals, how they're represented. However, I want to highlight that if we were to remove non-human animals from her works, they would be completely different. They would be, I believe, soulless, which just wouldn't make sense. So there are fundamental figures, not only in the setting, but also they play a big role within the story and the narrative. So I think this role is heightened when one studies the kinship between non-human animals and women and how they're portrayed throughout the novel. Having said that, I also think that there are some limitations to my study. It's an outsider's perspective. I'm not from Canada. I'm probably missing a lot of things when I read them. But I guess that also might be something good as I'm seeing other things. And as I mentioned before, this is only part of her literary work. I would have to have like 2 more lifetimes to study everything. And then maybe I could really grant that. But I think it's not that bad what I have so far. So this is all. And if there are any questions or any recommendations that you could give me, I would be happy to hear them. So thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, all of you. It was absolutely a wild ride, amazing, spanning from art to literature. Was great. If you've got any questions, and I would invite the people who have questions here next to the mic.
That apparently he didn't even see the rhino in real life. It came from other drawings that he then matched together, and there were also like text descriptions of it like having armor like skin, and so it was heralded as this. It still is kind of heralded as this observational drawing, but actually it's a myth. You didn't see it, and there's this so it's fascinating because it's again kind of like the power of the artist to build these imaginary creatures. And I was saying earlier to Richard when he was here about there's also a whole element of like art history which is about like taxidermy, and people like scientists at the time, basically cabinets of curiosities, like literally sewing together pieces of animals, which is really nasty, but like making these sea creatures or mermaids and then opening up these cabinets of curiosities and saying this is a real animal that we found. And it's all just like a really wacky, weird world and really morbid. But I think, yeah, important to always be thinking about the imagination, but the hybrid is what you're talking about as well. That kind of weird mash. It's gross. Really. Yeah, very. I mean, it's kind of again like, you know, art historians will get really excited about these artists using their imaginations, and again, not recognize, okay, well, there are also animals involved in some way in this process, like whether it's imaginatively, but they were still living around, they're still being used, like feathers, or, you know, the taxidermy is an obvious point. But yeah, I think at any point, if we're looking at these depictions, even if it's imaginative, we need to be thinking, okay, where did real animals come into it then? And yeah, thank you for asking it.
It's a really simple one. It's just, I want to know what you think about poetry and the Muad'Dib. Like, because he is the Muad'Dib, so he is in the Muad'Dib. I'm just thought from that. I don't know that much about you.
Yeah, so I think the figure of poets generally misinterpreted. I mean, everybody would first read that they tend to see him as a hero, but in fact, he's just a colonialist who has to his own motives to personal the debt to see. But I think it's a very interesting character. There's an even more interesting character who actually becomes the figure that's, and it's a very problematic figure, but it's very closely related to Samuel's as well. I won't say why, because that's a huge spoiler, but I think there are lots of very interesting characters. Like I said, there's 6 books, original books, but then it has 19 more and even more comic book adaptations, and there's lots of interesting characters. They are usually very ambivalent characters. They are very brave. See them as either. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
I got quite interested in a lot of like the underpinnings of what we're talking about, specifically representation of reality stuff and mimesis. And in my own research, I've been drawing that back to, you know, the ancient Greeks and stuff, Plato and Aristotle and things. I've been more aware of kind of Eastern artistic practice, where a lot of the essence, the mythos, the spirit of like the animal they're trying to present is just immediately apparent. You know, there's no attempt to legitimize it in terms of reality like it was in the West and such. But I'm just asking like an art historian, do you have any like examples of that?
First of all, I have to say, I'm very much in the like, and this is kind of gross, it's like I'm very in the like Italian Renaissance. That's my period. And so not gross and I love it, but you know, when it comes to Eastern art, I'm like, that's what I need to start really thinking more about. It's like comparing, I need to be like comparing, but also going into depth. So I'm a bit like at the start of it, but you know, thinking about definitely like, this is, I think the reason I'm interested in picking this era as well is because we hold it as the standard of knowledge and like, oh, this is the beginning of like progress. And like you say, actually, looking at artistic depictions of animals from other cultures in the same time period as well, it's like these are completely different like ways of doing it and need to be kind of, I mean, I'm not going to be the one going into like because I can't do it all, but
like the Western
having this
like
conversations, exactly, and that's why I'm interested as well in early 16th century art, because actually like there's still a lot of like hangover from the kind of freer parts of like the medieval art, you know. And so what we were saying about like imagining and like there's a kind of creativity at the start, which by the end of that century is very much like, it's much more like ingrained as like this is categorization, this is science. Yeah. So over that century is really like the kind of, because of colonialism, because of colonial expansion, and the mindset begins to shift so much in that sense.
That's a mindset, isn't it? Of having discovered everything.
Yeah.
Decided.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. And
Yeah.
being like, and now we're taking it
Yeah.
for ourselves and having it. So yeah, but I think in terms of representing reality, like this is a time, these decades are like, reality is shifting so much as well in terms of like what animals are actually around, what animals do these artists actually have access to. Again, by like 1630, 1640, they're going to have access to like loads more. Also important to remember, I guess, that like in the kind of 15th century, it was much more about like trading these animals rather than like extracting them. So it becomes, again, in the 16th century, it's not so much like diplomatic gifts. It's about like, we're actually bringing these back as a kind of colonial, as like we own this, rather than, you know, this is a gift from, so the rhino, I think, was a gift from a like West African king to the king of Portugal or something like that. Like it was a diplomatic gift, which is a horrible thing, and it died on the ship coming over, and it's, you know, but yeah.
Haunting in the concept.
It is, yeah. And so I guess what I mean by kind of like the comparative elements that come in, like, okay, we look at a image of a rhino like that, how does it compare to images of rhinos from like where they were actually from? It's going to be so different, and often much less depressing. So, yeah.
Thank you.
It's just a really basic and kind of forgive my ignorance question, but I'm just wondering if Atwood's said anything specifically about animal rights stuff, about representation of animals, not in the fictional work, but yeah, does she engage with that stuff? Does she talk about that stuff? Have people asked her stuff about that?
Thank you for the question. It's actually quite interesting because I love her work, but I have to say that she's a very great character. We don't really know much about her. Like, she writes so much. I'm trying to read also her essays that she has published. And on the one hand, she does seem to want to protect animals. And we, like in Angel Catbird, she's quite aware of animals and the harm that we have caused them. But then at the same time, we were talking about the other day, actually, she's not vegetarian, she's not vegan. And this is, she has, I think it's kind of, it actually quite makes sense. Like, it's the same relationship that she has with feminism. She doesn't consider herself feminist. Yeah, all her works have very female perspective. And I was just working on one of the chapters today, and it's just amazing seeing how throughout all her novels, there's always violence towards women, particularly rape. And she always there's always like a simile with a non-human animal. But we don't actually get to know her voice. Like, it really bothers me that I can't know. Like, I would love to go and ask her, okay, I would love to ask her that. What's your stance? What's exactly your point?
She said she's not vegetarian. Well, is that no
I haven't found anything that said that she's actually vegetarian vegan. I remember reading, I can't remember from when it's the essay that she wrote, but there was something that basically like makes you think that, okay, she does eat meat. Like, I can't remember what it was right now. I'm sorry, I've heard so much, but yeah, it's like she hasn't come out and said, okay, we need to do this. We need to go at least a vegetarian lifestyle. No. And the thing is, if you read, for example, The Edible Woman or the Madame trilogy, in the Madame trilogy, veganism is really important. But at the end of another one, there's a spoiler, they go back to eating meat, like the people that were vegan. So, yeah, sorry for the spoiler. So it's like in the first two novels, and so like halfway Were you reading it?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's okay.
So basically, like,
Read it now.
no, I know. So the first two novels and a half basically give a great representation. Like, it's quite interesting how it represents the vegan lifestyle. And then the last three chapters go on to, and they go back to meat, and it's like, in a way, okay, so she doesn't seem to be favoring vegans, but at the same time, I think it talks about humans are always going to repeat the same mistakes, and there's no going over civilization. The problem is us, not human animals. So again, I don't know.
Petition. Get to go vegan. Like, let's do it at the same time.
Well, maybe she has said it. So she's going to publish. I don't know. We're talking about she has a book coming out 100 years ago. So maybe in that one she actually talks about it, but I can't know.
Sorry, publish.
Yes. Yeah. So maybe I'll be alive until then, and I can add it to my details. I know it's horrible. Yeah, it's a time capsule. I'm not a clever artist.
Yeah.
Maybe in there she said something. So thank you for the question. I hope I answered it.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
There was time on the chat. Thank you. Elena, if you want to speak up, or I'll just read your question. No, she's still there. Anyway. Ooh, well, seems like. Bernie, do you want to share the answer to the room?
Yeah, I did share it.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
As we sort to get you up here. So there was something you mentioned about where you were talking about how the birds are quite evidently dead and therefore become like a malleable object for the artist. It got me thinking that there's a significant power dynamic going on there, that while you get the most accurate view of the aesthetic of the animal, the human artist gets the power over the position they're in and therefore kind of gets to write the history of how that animal moved or things like that. So thinking kind of not to ask a historian to start looking into the future, but thinking now of all the different art forms we have access to that seem to have such exponential power, thinking about things like AI generated images and things like that, what lessons do you think we can take from art history to apply to art in the future that will kind of help break down that really anthropocentric way of depicting animals in the future?
Okay, so I would say that my initial reaction is like the ways that you can create an artwork is the ways we view the artwork as well. So that's like the art historian speaking. I would say that like starting to have conversations where like beginning from now, like where galleries actually treat images of non-human animals as like as a notable subject, like something that you can actually have talks about or have, you know, just tours about or things like that is the starting point for conversations and shifts away. We're never going to be with art, you're never going to not be anthropocentric in a way because it's human made, but like yeah, exactly, that's something that I, you know, when I wrote in my MA dissertation, like I want to not be anthropocentric, and then wrote a whole thing about two artists. Because I was like, no, you can't do that. But you know, I think it's kind of like a bit of a like easy way out in a way to say like, oh, we're gonna think about how we look. but I think we're seeing that with like decolonizing museum spaces slowly and often not as effectively as it should be, but like starting to have conversations. And I think that then artists also are doing amazing things now. And like I'm kind of, you know, that's the frustration, is like the art history, especially with like canonical works of art that in the West we view as like the, you know, founding parts of civilization and all of that stuff, which really annoys me. But that is also something that we need to kind of, artists are breaking that down now, but the history is still there. So we're kind of assume we have these narratives that we're just used to going through. So I would say, like, yeah, think about how we look, and also educating, you know, young kids about how we're looking. That's the future of it, I guess. Just, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I do have a question for you. Just out of curiosity, you talked about human power over animals, and on the representation side, so I'm aware that you might not see the side, but have thought of considering what's behind the realization, paintings, frescoes, in terms of material, so where the pigments come from, you know, those, so that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I have thought about that. I think for me, I've wanted to emphasize the kind of conceptual sides of it more, because quite a lot of like thinking about eco-criticism in art history, often people think it needs to be about animals, it needs to be about the materials, or taxidermy, because that's originally animals, kind of going into the more physical side of it. And even with the talk today, like it doesn't just have to be animals or images of the natural world, it can be kind of any aspect of thinking about, yeah, anyway, I won't start on that, but you know, thinking about like how pigments are made, where they came from, like the kind of and again at this stage as well, you know, it's brought influx into Europe of whole new range of materials. That's definitely something that needs to be tapped into. I would say for me also, like, it's very technical often. I'm really bad at science and at like the technical analysis and stuff, but I think that's something that is like ready to be explored and super exciting, but needs to be viewed as well, not just in relation to, oh, this is really interesting because the artists are starting to use this pigment. Oh, great. Actually thinking about like, okay, well, what insects are made out of? How does that relate to these bigger questions? Always thinking about non-human presence as well. Otherwise we just end up in the same place. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Otherwise, I will go right.